Hello, everyone. Yate. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. All the leaders here appreciate your time. Suzanne Singer, Yanishia, Kanisatni Nishle, Nakaidne, Bashichin, Bibetwadi, Dashache, Doshin, Dashanala. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. I'm the executive director of Native Renewables. We are a nonprofit organization based in Arizona, but we really formed in 2016 and have grown a lot these past few years to fill a need within our community. And within the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Nation, there's roughly tens of thousands of families who still do not have access to grid-tied electricity. So we really formed partly out of frustration, but really there is a need that needs to be filled. And there are families who are not connected to the grid, have been waiting over 10 years in some cases. The economics of it is really challenging for extending utility lines. Like I've seen anywhere between 40,000 and 75,000 per mile is the cost to extend it to a family. And a lot of times they're responsible for paying for that cost themselves. So what we wanted to do was really build up our capacity and empower our own people. And that's through off-grid solar. And it's not exactly community solar, but I'll still share some of the things that we've learned and I think can be translated to other projects as well. Some other things I'll add before I talk more about the presentation. Other things that I think are happening. So solar is definitely a growing economy. There's a lot more need, there's more need for jobs every year. A few weeks ago, I participated in a low carbon fuels stakeholder meeting. So that's something else I think you should be aware of, that there are conversations happening, particularly here in New Mexico, to build legislation to invest in low carbon fuels. So a lot of times people think electric vehicles, there's other types of fuels as well. So that also has implications for the solar industry and also the workforce needed to be able to install electric vehicle charging stations. So I'll start with that. But this is just a picture of, pretty common what it's like to live without electricity. You're relying on kerosene, propane, you're hauling water. Sometimes your nearest neighbor is miles away. Your food, water, infrastructure could be a few hours away. And so it just creates this really, it's a challenge to live in this environment. Of course, it's our traditional ways, but, as we get more technological advances, it becomes harder and harder to incorporate those into our communities. And just this is some of the stuff I mentioned before, but what's also hopefully well known is that also Indigenous communities have higher energy burden costs, a lot more than other, traditional US family that's connected to the utility grid. And I think also without access to electricity, it becomes harder to have refrigeration. Families who need medicine, it becomes a big challenge for them as well. People to store food, and all this was really amplified during COVID. So our mission is to empower Native communities, building our own capacity and really pushing that energy independence within the home. So we mostly work with the residential scale. So families learn how to manage their own energy loads. And it's really critical, especially for off-grid. You don't get to an unlimited amount of energy. Well, I won't say unlimited, but you don't get all the energy you need as long as you pay for it. You only get a certain amount of energy. So we are, I think what makes us unique is we're all Indigenous, led with Navajo and Hopi people. So a lot of folks you see on this team were composed of like engineers and scientists. Some were students who came to do some of our workforce training with us. Others were like tradespeople, electricians and welders. And all of them really wanted to become more invested in the solar industry. Some of them because they wanted to learn how to install solar. Some of them because they had solar and they didn't know how to fix it. So that's the other big piece I think we're learning is historically there's a model of outside companies coming in, and some of them want to do good, but they essentially come in, drop technology and they leave. And then people are frustrated because they don't know who to call to fix it. So that's the other piece I think of building our own technical capacity, is to be able to maintain our own equipment and systems, I think is really important. So we're waiting for people to come and visit. Like in the worst case, some people charge $5,000 just to come to your home. Like you don't even do any work. So that's just kind of a base cost to cover their travel expenses. So within our programs, we also want to install new solar systems for residential scale. We're focusing on training folks to do maintenance on equipment that is not stuff that we installed, but we're learning how to fix it, change out batteries, troubleshoot what exactly is going wrong with the system. But yeah, education is a really big piece of what we do. Like we want all people, all ages, to understand the basics of solar energy, how it works. And especially for those families and the children who live off grid, is what are the things you should not be doing with your system? Like if it's small, you should not be plugging in washers and dryers and heating elements, things that consume a lot of energy. And so those are kind of big pieces of our program. So when we first started, we started going out to different communities within Navajo and Hopi nations. And we were fortunate to have someone on our team who's been in the field for 30 plus years. And she recently got recognized for an award, which is amazing. But having those one-day educational events where we answer questions about what is off-grid solar, we have the families start writing down what, if you could plug in anything, what do you want to plug in? And then we have them start calculating their wattage and how long they're going to use it for. And then they price out their whole system and then they freak out because it's a lot of money. And we're like, all right, now cut everything you don't need to try to get it within a certain cost or a certain size. So those are some of the things we do in the classroom. And then we take them outside and we let them play with some of the tools. I think intrinsically we understand the sun, its patterns and its path for farming. And so it's just kind of neat to have them affirm that knowledge with, something like this, which is Solar Pathfinder, which is a tool that helps you show where shading is around where you are. So it helps you site the best location for a solar unit. And then after that, we decided to have our very first pilot workforce training program. So one thing we wanted to do was absolutely necessary was it had to be in one of our communities. So we were fortunate to have the buy-in. So we had it at Hard Rock chapter, and I think that made a huge difference. The leadership there was excited to have us there. They wanted us there. They gave us the space, the classroom space to be in for 2 months, which I think is a long time to take over a space. We partnered with other organizations and they fed us. Like that's a really big draw to get people to come in. So every day we ate really good. I think other things we wanted to make sure we tried to offer, and we're still learning, it wasn't perfect, but professional development. So if people didn't work with us and they wanted to go out into the field, if they had never written a resume before, we wanted to help them with that. If they had never interviewed before, we wanted to help them with that. One thing I would change is we would talk about how to read a job posting. So some of these skills I think are really useful if they want to work, an outside company. That's really important to learn. We also wanted to think about those things. The other part of the model we wanted to change was to not have them pay for their classes. So we covered their travel expenses, we fed them. And I think that also helped them. And just to give you a sense of how successful it was, some people drove hundreds of miles a week and everybody came and finished. All 10 people that started finished the entire program. And 4 of those were women, which is really exciting. So here's some other pictures. We were featured in a documentary. So if you have time, Nation in Transition we were in a small minute or 2 of it. But we also provided people OSHA training because safety is also really important to what it is that we do. Our second program, we pulled people. So the first pilot project, most of them had no experience with solar energy. The second pilot project we did is we brought people in who had some experience before, and we put them through training where we had them learn about each of the components. We had very manufacturer specific training, and then we had them put together a system and then commission it and decommission it. So they got to see what it was like to do that in the field. Of course, we also had internet and the roads were great and it wasn't raining or anything. So those are all the things that are challenging in the field. And then recently, because of COVID, like we had plans to do this in lots of other communities, but because of COVID hit, we had to transition what we were doing. So we were fortunate to find partners who have done this before for many years under the solar energy, brain fart, sorry, SEI, who's a big training group within the solar industry. So we had people who had formed their own company. We're now doing remote training for us. So we are starting to offer intro to off-grid solar classes virtually. So it's about, I think, 40 hours on a month over 4 weeks, and you take it on your own time. So if any of you are interested, we have some slots available for our next trainings. But people who go through that, they get a certificate after that. And anyone who finishes, we invite them to come visit us and get hands-on with us. So they start small, they put together something like a really small module on their own. As they get more comfortable, they do bigger things. And then we invite them to come out in the field with us and do some of this work. So this is just an example of some of the stuff that we do in the field, putting modules together. It's a little bit different than grid connected. So we have battery storage. There's a lot of safety things we have to be mindful of. Connecting it to the home, we have to think about the integrity of the home. So we have to do a lot of stuff on the ground. We don't even touch rooftops in most cases. So this has been really exciting. And our first cohort that we brought through, they are now training our younger cohorts. And that's been just really awesome to see. So here's a link to some of our social media, my email, if you have any questions. But I guess just some closing thoughts. I think having partnerships is really great, but pick partners that you trust and that you like and that respect you, your culture, your values. I like the questions earlier about the recycling. That's something we ask of our partners as well. Like if you want to offer us a lithium battery, what do we do with it? And a lot of companies are like, well, in 20 years, there'll be a process for that. And so we have to decide, do we want to do that? Or do we want to stick with lead acid batteries, which is recyclable right now? So these are the kind of trade-offs that we have to think about. And then cost, how do we keep the cost down? But how do we also allow families to plug in more things and use it for longer? So these are a lot of challenges that we're dealing with. I think one thing I learned this week as well in terms of the PV recycling, there was a webinar that happened this week, and there's a new website, solarrecycle.org, which is going to be a list compiled of PV modules. And then there's other things that are happening. So people call it Second Life Solar. So people who do large scale installations, if they have like little dings on solar modules and they can't use them anymore, but they're perfectly good. Like sometimes we'll take them if they're over 350, 380 watts. But then we have to start thinking about our end of life cycle. So just because we can reuse it doesn't mean that we don't have a process, or doesn't mean that we have a process of what to do with it afterwards as well. And then I think also in terms of partners, and some of you are doing this is great, but ask them to train you, ask them to focus. Like we ask manufacturers all the time, I know you give free classes, but can you give a class to us, just the 10 of us, because we have a very specific need. And a lot of times they do. I mean, sometimes they don't, but a lot of times they will, which is really great. And I think also in terms of like larger scale installs, think about asking them to hire your people long-term, not just temporarily, not to just put up solar panels, but invest in them so that they can be experts and then come back. So I think I'm getting close to time. Oh, I guess one last thing, sorry, kind of all over the place, I had too much coffee. I think other things to think of in the workforce, like what kind of incentives do you want to offer people? So we've been thinking about like tools, what kind of safety equipment, we've bought safety clothing for our team. So just things like travel incentives, help pay for their cell phone service, because sometimes they use their phone to call you. So I think just getting creative about those kinds of things is also really important. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate